I'm Holly Page with No Labels, here for another week's edition of No Labels Talks with the fabulous Ryan Clancy. Ryan, how are you doing?
I'm good. Aren't you all excited about the debate tonight?
So excited.
It's excitement like the same way, people get excited to go to a NASCAR race to just because they want to see a car crash. I mean,
Exactly.
yeah, that's what
Yeah.
that's what it feels like.
I'm almost afraid to watch, to be honest, but I will because I know that I'll be interested to hear how it all turns out for sure.
Well, it's like I feel like these debates typically don't matter that much, but this one does feel like it does. A lot of things could turn on this, one.
I think that debates matter for reasons that most people don't think. I did work for Bill Clinton in 1992. I was a child, by the way. But and when President Bush did look at his watch, that really sent a very significant message that I don't think we were even aware of working on the campaign at the time. And I think people are looking for clues about these folks, and certainly given the age situation with our two current front-running candidates, it will be clues about their ability to, do the job.
Yeah, well, and of course, the format will be very different from the last couple of years. No studio audience. They negotiated the rules that they're gonna cut off the mics after a certain period of time. Well, look, we will be live tweeting the debate later. No Labels will, so you'll certainly get to see what we think of that. Shifting gears, our No Labels talks today was not about really the debate or even this election. It was a much bigger discussion with Yuval Levin at AEI about our Constitution and how a lot of what ails us today, the answers for it can be found in that document.
Well, I always think about Albert Einstein, who said if he was given an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes of it thinking about the cause and only 5 minutes on the solution. And I think part of what we get into in this terrific talk today are some root causes and some root dysfunction of the system that I think it's important to really look at so that we can address it. So it was really interesting.
Yeah, people will hear in a couple of minutes here. He's got this new book out, American Covenant. And look, what's interesting is it runs counter to a lot of what we see today from people who want to, quote, reform the system, because in a lot of ways, the Constitution, for some reformers, is a barrier to be trampled over. And there's a lot of things people want to do today, be it abolishing the Electoral College or getting rid of the filibuster, which interestingly enough, Yuval says not only would that not help, that would push us in the other direction. It would make things worse because he said the one thing that the Electoral College and the filibuster have in common, if you got rid of them, is that each of them it would disincentivize our talking to one another. In the case of the Electoral College, and talking to the broadest amount of people, and in the case of the filibuster, actually trying to build coalitions.
Absolutely. So I'm actually, it looks like I'm at home, but I'm really in Missouri here at a Girls State, which is a really interesting program that most states have. And these rising senior high school women, young women, are really in the thick of electing their own representative government and understanding the trade-offs and the balance of power. And I think, it's very fragile how it all was constructed, and there is always unintended consequences for any sort of reform, and we have to remember that whenever somebody's trying to sell us a panacea idea.
I think if you ask the public whether if they could replace the entire Congress with the high school girls at your meeting tomorrow, I think that'd be like a 70% yes.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, you know what, actually, anybody who can see it, and there's a documentary on Apple called Girl State, about Girl State, Missouri. And anybody who can witness this and come kind of see the energy and enthusiasm that these young ladies bring to this project. It will restore a little bit of hope and faith. We have to wait a few years until they're even legal to vote, but we've got a lot of challenges. So I'm sure there'll be plenty for them to master by the time they get of age.
Well, if nothing else, members of Congress should watch it. They can probably learn a few things. But well, look, I'll check that out. But first, I'm going to check out this debate tonight, and I'm sure you will be too, and we'll all be talking about it tomorrow. I want to make sure I invite people back tomorrow morning after the debate. I'll be hosting a discussion with Mark Halperin, really well-known political journalist, as well as some folks from our polling and modeling team, to just get a read on what happened in the election, and most importantly, what does it mean going forward. So everybody, please be sure to tune into that. In the meantime, enjoy this edition of No Labels Talks with Yuval Levin. Hey everybody, this is Ryan Clancy here with another episode of No Labels Talks, and pretty consequential day. We're having this discussion. We have the debate between President Biden and former President Trump this evening. We're going to get into that a bit later, along with some other things with my guest, Yuval Levin, who's the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Yuval, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
So you have, just so people get a little bit about your background, you are at AEI. You've served as a congressional committee staffer on the domestic policy team of Bush 41, constantly commenting publicly on public policy and political issues, and the author of several books, the latest of which is American Covenant. How the Constitution united our nation and could again. It just came out last week. So let's start there. Would love you to tell us a little bit about the book, beginning with this. What was the spark that got you thinking that you wanted to write about the Constitution and apply it to our current moment?
Yeah, I came to it very much from the current moment. I have been thinking for the last at least decade or so in my work about the roots of our divided time. Americans are clearly living through a kind of social crisis, and it displays itself especially in various forms of division, polarization, isolation, alienation, loneliness, whether it's from people's personal lives all the way up to the character of our national political culture. There's a sense of brokenness. And this has been a subject of my work now for a while. And I would say, in a sense, that work has moved from diagnosis to prescription gradually and incrementally, from thinking about how we got here and the sources of fragmentation and polarization, to thinking a little bit about what could be done. And what could be done has to force us to think about institutional change and the character of our political culture. And I was moved to think about this through the lens of the Constitution, because ultimately the American Constitution is an effort to facilitate some cohesion in a divided and diverse society. That's what it's for. That's what it was for originally. When it explains its purposes, the first one is to form a more perfect union. If you look at the way that its authors argued for it, the first third or so of the Federalist Papers are really about the need for union and unity. We don't often think about the Constitution that way now, but it really is there to allow us to hang together as a vast, immense democracy that's always been pretty diverse. And there are ways, therefore, that it could particularly speak to this moment. I think we associate the Constitution with our division now, because some of the things we're divided about are constitutional questions. We disagree about the character of basic rights and some of the actions of the Supreme Court and so on. But at its core, the Constitution is there to facilitate a particular kind of unity. And I think not only in order to help people better know the Constitution, which is one purpose of the book, but also to help people think about what unity actually means in a diverse
when you think about politics today, and of course, everybody will talk about how much we disagree on everything and all that kind of stuff. One of the things you say is that's sort of the point of the Constitution. One of the things you say about it is it's designed to help us act together, even when we don't think alike. So talk a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Exactly. I think the problem in contemporary American political life is not that we've forgotten how to agree with each other, but that we've forgotten how to disagree with each other. We don't know how to do it well. And even people who are very involved in politics spend most of our time not engaged in active disagreement with people of different views. We spend our time with people we agree with, talking about people we disagree with. And we've lost the sense that the purpose of our system is to force us into a process of dealing with people we disagree with. And that ultimately is how the Constitution operates. Its idea of unity, as you say, is not that unity means that we should all think alike, but rather that it means that we should act together. And that means that we have to look for ways to act together even when we don't think alike. And in a sense, the Constitution is an answer to the question, how can we act together when we don't think alike? Its answer takes a number of forms. One of the forms is competition through elections, but also through the character of federalism, the separation of powers, the bicameral legislature. All these things are ways of creating competition between competing factions in American life. And secondly, it's about negotiation, which is really the core way in which people who differ and disagree are meant to deal with each other in our system. And at the center of the process of negotiation in our system is Congress. Part of what I argue in the book is that the biggest problem in our constitutional system, and in some ways all the problems in our constitutional system now, emanate from the deformation of the Congress. And the most significant work to be done is actually congressional reform and renewal. That's a lot of what my work is about, and it's a lot of what the book is about.
You know, the Constitution, like so many other things, though, even that over the last couple of years has become a partisan issue. And so, and certainly up until maybe right before the Trump era, you know, when you would hear Republicans and conservatives talk, it was with such veneration for the Constitution. Every time there was a conservative judge trying to get confirmed, there was just this talking about how much they respect the Constitution. That is not the case so much on the liberal side. For them, the Constitution is often a problem to be solved. And of course, it is very flawed in a lot of ways. We had to amend it dozens of times, including the 13th and 14th Amendment to get rid of slavery and expand equal rights. But with that said, you have said that progressives, you think, should be given another look at the Constitution as it was written and understand that in that document is a lot that they should like. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, you know, the strongest and smartest critiques of the Constitution have always been critiques of the ways in which it restrains political action and government action. And it does. The Constitution restrains uses of power. And that means that people who have more of an ambition to see government act, which has tended to be progressives in our politics, are much more impatient with the Constitution and will point out that it is very difficult, even when you win an election, to actually act on what you committed to your voters to do. That's true. And in relation to a lot of other democracies in the world, the American Constitution restricts narrow majorities in a way that really stands out. So in the European parliamentary systems, if you have a majority of whatever scope, you have all the power in the system. You can act, you can advance your agenda until you lose your mandate or until you lose the next election. The American system has never worked that way. It's always worked on the premise that what's required first and foremost is some degree of coalition building, and that you have to work with people you disagree with, even when you win an election, so that every newly elected president, lots of newly elected congressional majorities eventually find themselves in this position of sitting in a room and thinking to themselves, why am I talking to these people? I just beat them in the election. And it's true, but the answer is offered by the Constitution, which says, well, these people are here. They won too, and they are part of they're part of the society that you have to govern. The American Constitution compels coalition building. It forces majorities to grow before they can be empowered. And so it doesn't work through simple majoritarianism. It works through a kind of mitigated majoritarianism. The reason for that is very straightforward. Majority rule is absolutely necessary for political legitimacy, but majorities can be very dangerous to the rights of minorities. And the American system is, I think, uniquely aware of this for some obvious historical reasons, among other things, that majorities can be oppressive. And therefore, in a time of narrow majorities, like the time that we are living in, and really for the last 30 years, we've had only narrow majorities, the Constitution can certainly be very frustrating. And it's increasingly frustrating to people on the right as well as on the left. And you find a lot of impatience with it, a lot of frustration with it. But I think the system is built so that that kind of frustration can be channeled into coalition building. And when it works well, the frustration drives people to deal with each other. I think right now it is not working well, again, because the core institution of the system, the US Congress, is not geared for coalition building. The incentives that confront members are not well suited to encourage coalition building. And so I think the focus has to be on fixing that problem.
Well, that's one of the disconnects you identify. In fact, you said Democrats and Republicans are actually both minority parties.
Yes.
And they're not much interested in coalition building at all. A lot of people have talked about, even when you think about this election, it's very clear. You see a lot of base mobilization going on, less clear that there's outreach to the middle. So here's a question though. On the one hand, you're saying a lot of what ails us, the answers to it are to be found in the Constitution. On the other hand, we have these institutions that are really broken, beginning with Congress, and they need to be reformed for the modern era. So when you think about Congress, what's wrong with it, what would be on your top list of things we could do that would fix Congress in a way that respects the spirit and, of course, the letter of the Constitution?
Yeah, let me stress the way you put that question, which I think is quite right, that the reason to think about the Constitution is not to say that it's fine, that there's nothing wrong, that things are going well. That's not true. The reason to think about the Constitution is to help us understand what has gone wrong, what we are missing, what the dysfunction that we're witnessing actually consists of. And I think that's particularly important when we think about Congress, because it's easy to look at Congress and say what it's failing to do is pass major legislation. At some level, that's certainly true. We have large problems that are not being addressed by the national legislature. And the failure to do that is a problem for the country. But I think it's important to realize, and you see this clearly when you look at Congress through the lens of the Constitution, that first of all, what it's failing to do is facilitate cross-partisan bargaining and negotiation. Now, that's the reason why they're not passing major legislation. But that means that the failure to pass big bills on Social Security or the environment or or immigration is a result of the fact that Congress is not doing a good job of facilitating cross-partisan bargaining and negotiation. Seeing it that way is important to seeing what solutions should look like, because if the fundamental problem is big bills aren't getting passed, then we would say we need to remove some of the inefficiencies and obstacles to action in the system, like get rid of the filibuster, empower leaders to be able to move more quickly. If the problem is that cross-partisan bargaining is not getting facilitated, then in a funny way, we actually need more of those kind of obstacles that would force the parties to the table. And the solution is not exactly efficiency. The solution is to compel cross-partisan negotiation. The filibuster actually does that. It's part of the solution, in my view, and not part of the problem. We need to rethink how it works in some ways, and I argue for that in the book, but I don't think that getting rid of it is part of the solution here. I'd put it this way. The problem congressional reformers face is a function of two factors. On the one hand, our system requires a lot of cross-partisan bargaining. On the other hand, we're living in a moment where there is not a lot of cross-partisan bargaining. So the question is, do we want changes that would make that kind of negotiation less necessary, or that would make it more likely? And I think we want changes that would make it more likely.
Yeah. Well, so let me play this out, because I'm going to ask you this because I think I know where you'd land. But so a great example, reconciliation.
Yeah.
So it's this congressional vehicle which was created in 1974, and when it was created, it was supposed to do exactly what it sounds like, to reconcile. It was this tool that at the end of a process, kind of like you reconcile your books, you fix a few odds and ends. It has now become the primary vehicle of domestic policymaking. It's how the Trump tax bill got passed. It's how President Biden passed his major stuff. So I guess what you'd be saying is, if we made it harder to pass bills via reconciliation, which only requires 51 votes, that might force more cross-party collaboration.
Exactly right. I think that empowering narrow majorities is the wrong direction to go in. And I think reconciliation is part of a larger problem. The entire 1974 budget process, which is how Congress budgets, how Congress ultimately spends public money, was created in a moment that was halfway through a 40-year period of one-party control of Congress. It was there to facilitate a Democratic Congress in competition with mostly Republican presidents in that very peculiar 40-year period after World War II. That is not the world we're living in. And Congress needs to think about what a budget process that can serve it in the 21st century would look like. I think that it would look not at all like the budget process we have. I think the two budget committees that were created by that 74 budget process, and I used to be a House Budget Committee staffer. I can appreciate the good things about that process. The two budget committees now are pure partisan vehicles. The budget resolutions just create these imaginary partisan fantasy budgets that don't actually have anything to do with what ends up happening. People just talk separately in two different partisan silos. And then at midnight, before a government shutdown, four people, the leaders of the two houses, reach some agreement that most other members of Congress have nothing to do with. That's obviously not how the national legislature should work. And Congress should think about what a budget process for a 21st century Congress should look like. I think it needs to look like much more empowered authorizing committees. The congressional committees that know the areas of policy best need to do real legislative work, not just work that gets ignored at the end of the process. I would argue even for breaking the barrier between appropriation and authorization, letting these committees spend money, as a number of state legislatures do. I think there are other ways to learn from the state legislatures. Congress could, for example, allow committees, when a committee passes a bill with at least one vote from the minority party, they could let that bill get floor time, whether the speaker or the majority leader wants to or not. Give the committees more control. That's where negotiation can happen. That's where cross-partisan bargaining can happen. It isn't happening there now because what happens in the committees is just not worth the time and attention of serious members of Congress. It ultimately gets ignored and the leaders do everything on their own. I think beginning to change that, to decentralize power in both houses some, would make a big difference in allowing Congress to function better. That centralization, it was driven at first by Democrats in the 1970s, then it was supercharged by Newt Gingrich and Republicans in the 1990s. And ultimately, in retrospect, it was a serious mistake.
Yeah. Well, here's the challenge we run into, though. So even if you stipulate that the reforms you suggested would help, and to be clear, No Labels have been looking at a lot of these. We think they're a great idea. And that 74 process, that 74 bill is the original sin that has messed up a lot of other things. But getting that done requires fixing another problem. It has to do more with leadership. And one of the things you write, this is true of political and media elites in general, but certainly of a lot of members of Congress. You say they have a pathological habit of using the institutions that employ them as platforms for which to project their brands and personalities. In other words, these members of Congress, which we want to fix the budget rules, do not see themselves first and foremost as legislators. They see themselves as brands. What do you do about that problem?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. They've come to see, I mean, in a sense, you know, we face a strange problem in our constitutional system now, a problem that I would describe as congressional underactivity, maybe even underambition, which is just not a problem that the framers of the Constitution conceived. They thought everybody in the system would be very ambitious, everyone would want power, and the system would work by people restraining each other's pursuit of power. Congress today doesn't want to use the authority that it has. And instead, members want to use Congress as a platform for performance, to become celebrities on social media or on cable news or on talk radio. They see the institution as a platform, as you say, to build their own brand. And so the psychology at the center of our system is not wrong. These are ambitious people. They want to be prominent and important. But they've come to see the path to prominence, not as being effective legislators, but as being celebrities, as being big public voices. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. that we can think about changing. When you think about reform, you can't just think about where the problem came from, because solutions, I'd put it this way, I think that prescriptions are not diagnoses in reverse. You can't just say this happened for this reason, so we should do it in reverse. We can't. We can't undo the transformation of American culture that's been wrought by social media, for example, or the bifurcation of our culture and polarization, the geographic sorting by ideology. Those are things that I don't think we can just simply change by public policy. But the incentives that face politicians can be changed by changing electoral rules and institutional rules. And so some of the things that I've just been talking about and that No Labels has been working on for years about empowering committees and changing the rules of how Congress works would help to change some of those incentives, so that to be successful would mean to be effective at legislating. But I also think we have to think about the primary system that populates our political system. The primaries mean that our political process begins with the question, what would the two ends of the parties, the people who are at the fringes of both parties, what would they like to see happen in the political system in this election cycle? That is the wrong question to start with. It's the wrong question for the parties to start with. It hurts them that this is how they select candidates. And I think it's well past time to start experimenting with reforms of the primary process that could help us to think about how to populate the system with people who are inclined and incentivized to legislate, to bargain and negotiate with each other, and think about advancing legislative vehicles.
Do you have, there's a lot of reforms out there to that end. And of course, when you look at the House of Representatives, for example, out of those 435 districts, maybe 40 or 50 of them are actually competitive. Tom Davis, who's co-founder of ours, says, in most of these districts, the general election is a constitutional formality. Once you get past the primary, you're going to win. What do you think of some of the reforms? Some people like the idea of open primaries, so you ensure that independent and unaffiliated voters could get in there. People have, of course, heard about ranked choice voting. It's a little bit of a mixed record as to whether that is delivered on its promise. But are there any that you're particularly keen on?
Yeah, so I get into this quite a bit in the book. I think, first of all, I come at this as someone who believes in the importance of political parties. I think the parties as institutions are a very important sort of missing piece of the constitutional puzzle. They're not defined by the Constitution, but they're necessary for the system to function well. And ultimately, the parties as institutions are actually moderators of our system. Their interest is in creating a broad tent. The Republican Party, the Democratic Party wants to elect people in the Deep South and in the Northwest, so they have to make room. But somehow that's not happening now. And the reason has a lot to do with the nature of the primary process. So I am an advocate of ranked choice voting in primaries, not in general elections. I think the effect of it would actually be very different in primaries than in general elections. In a general election, ranked choice would tend to undermine the two parties, to weaken them as institutions, and to allow candidates to run as individual brands on their own name. But within the party, to use a ranked choice primary would mean that in order to succeed, you'd need to be somebody who is some people's first choice and many people's second choice. That is the kind of politician who would be good at building coalitions. I think coalition building is the fundamental skill we have lost. That's what we've forgotten how to do at every level of the system. And it's especially important in building out the party coalitions. A person who's good at building a broad coalition within the party will be more inclined to also be a coalition builder as a member of Congress or as a politician elsewhere in the system. And so I think it's worth experimenting now with ranked choice in primaries, where it's been tried. For example, the Virginia Republican Party tried this in the gubernatorial race in 2021 and ended up with Glenn Youngkin, a candidate who can win a purple state, who would not have been the candidate if not for the ranked choice primary. So I think there's reason to try that. And, the decentralized character of our election system lets us experiment. It means we can try different things, see how they work. Some of them will work, some of them will not. And I don't think we should begin by assuming that we know exactly what will work. Political reforms never work quite the way we think, but it seems to me that this is an idea worth trying.
You know, of course, that No Labels had its own little experiment trying to shake up the system. In the end, we were not able to find somebody who wanted to get on our presidential unity ticket. But of course, the public's frustration with their choices and their desire for something better remains. I'm curious, do you, as you look over the horizon, and let's be pessimistic for a moment. We can be optimistic when we get to the end, but let's be pessimistic in assuming that the parties continue to just not get it. They continue down their current path in which they just keep narrow casting to their base as they ignore this growing share of frustrating people in the middle. Do you see the end result of this as the creation of a new political party somewhere along the lines if this doesn't change?
Well, I think that it's unlikely to continue simply in this way. I think that a two-party politics is pretty entrenched in the American system. It's entrenched in law in many states, but I think it's also just a straightforward function of the logic of the way we elect presidents. The Electoral College, because it requires an absolute majority in order to win, more than two serious candidates means the election goes to the House. And that's something that everybody wants to avoid, and with good reason. So I think there's a very, very strong imperative to have two parties. But we've been living now in a period of 30 years where both parties have been losing. And, you know, when they win just barely, a tiny sliver of a majority in a presidential election, or a tiny congressional majority. And losing so narrowly prevents the parties from learning much from their losses. The only way politicians really can learn a lesson is by losing. And neither party feels like it's been losing in the last 25 years or so. And so they just tend to do the same thing over again. I mean, we see it quite literally in this election, where the Republican Party is running the person who lost last time to the person he lost to. That is a failure of party thinking. That's a failure of the party system in a very profound way. The job of the parties is to win elections, and neither of them is really behaving now like that's their job. I think this opens up an opportunity for the first party to see its way out of that, and for someone with real political talent to arise and build a broader coalition than we've seen. Not an 80% coalition. I don't think anybody's going to win 49 states as Ronald Reagan did in 1984. That's not where we live now. But if you win 55% of the vote, you'd win a bigger election victory than anybody has in 30 years. That is doable. I think the parties have persuaded themselves that it's impossible to win big. And it seems to me that they are wrong about that, and that running higher quality candidates could dramatically alter that calculation. So that there's just a huge opportunity here that neither of them has succeeded in seeing so far. I don't think that's durable. I don't think we're going to continue down this path, because it is a losing path. And look, an election where two 80-year-old candidates are running against each other just feels like the end of a phase in our politics, not the beginning. And I do think that we should be thinking about what the next phase can look like.
You know, you wrote something interesting a couple of years ago. We're here in this election, of course, both President Biden and former President Trump have been calling one another dictators. It's just exchanging that barb with one another. You wrote, though, that both of them, but for very different reasons, are two of the weakest presidents you've ever seen. And I'm curious if you just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you know, this is a time when when everybody talks about the president being too strong, almost just as a kind of instinct. But in fact, I think that the current president and his predecessor have been very weak chief executives. I think President Biden has not really laid out a clear vision of his own priorities that can move his political appointees and the larger executive branch to advance his ideas. I mean, you've just asked yourself, what are the three things President Biden wants to achieve? I don't know the answer to that question. It's hard to see what his own priorities are. And that makes a big difference when you work in an administration. You sort of need to know, what would the president do if he was in my job? I think it's very hard for political appointees right now to say. And of course, in the Trump era, what we saw was utter chaos. And chaos does not make for effective administration. It was very, very hard for Donald Trump to impose his will on the bureaucracy. And it's not just because some deep state was opposed to him politically, but because he just had no sense of what it meant to be an administrator and an executive. I think in both cases, there was a lot of room for Congress to step in and advance its own agenda. Congress did not want to and has not wanted to. I don't think the problem right now is that the president is too strong. I think the problem in our system now is that Congress is intentionally too weak.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things we say, it just so happens as we're talking today, the Supreme Court is, releasing a litany of decisions.
Yeah.
A lot of people have written about that one of the consequences of Congress not settling issues is they constantly get thrown to the courts.
Absolutely.
And they have to do things Congress should properly be doing.
Absolutely. I think a lot of what the Supreme Court says now, and it's not 6-3, these are 7-2, 8-1, 9-0 decisions, is basically the court saying to Congress, please do your job. This is not our job.
We're coming up on time, and knowing that the debate is tonight, one of the questions we've been asking everybody that we have on No Labels Talks in the last couple of weeks is, if you were in the moderator chair and you had a single question that you could ask, either one question of both of them, or one each. I'm curious if you have one in mind.
You know, what's striking to me in looking at this presidential election is how little it is directed to the future of the country. I think there's a sense that both candidates are trying to give to the country that if you elect the other guy, then it's all over. And that's really a way to avoid thinking about the future. I think the question I would put to them is, what is the United States going to need in 20 years to thrive that it doesn't have now? Maybe that's a different approach to the entitlement system or to budgeting and fiscal policy. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it has to do with infrastructure or the military or whatever it is. How do you think about what the country is going to need in a generation that it doesn't have today? I think that's a question that any politician who wants to be our chief executive should have an answer to. And I'd be very curious to know if either of them does.
Well, Yuval, I hope we get that question and that kind of discussion. I can't say I'm confident.
Yeah, me neither.
That we're going to, but we can hope. Yuval, thank you so much for taking a couple minutes.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
On No Labels Talks. Everybody, Yuval Levin from AEI, please go out and buy his new book, American Covenant. He's such a thoughtful guy and such a great thinker.